Good morning, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm welcoming you to a session that will be taking place now in the next hour and a half. My name is Alan Grieco, and I will be chairing this session on cookery or medicine, ? Which is the first of two panels that are dedicated to this subject. The second one will be tomorrow, as you probably have seen in your programs. This topic has been touched upon very often during this conference, as you know if you've been following it. But now, today, it's being broached in a very direct manner, so cookery or medicine. The questions, excuse me. The questions will be fielded by Virginie Hullet, both in French and in English. She will translate when necessary from one language back to the other. So thank you, Virginie, for your help this morning.
You're welcome. So for the Q&A, you have a button below your screen. Don't hesitate to ask the question during the talk, and I come back with the question after. Bon, pour la conférence de Madeleine Ferrières, elle aura lieu en français, donc vous pouvez poser des questions en français ou en anglais. Je m'occuperai de la traduction. Et pour poser les questions, vous pouvez aller sur le bouton questions et réponses Q&R, qui est en bas de votre écran. Et durant la présentation, posez les questions, comme ça je peux les avoir directement et les poser pour vous à la fin de la présentation. Voilà, merci beaucoup.
Yes, I'd like to remind everybody that, of course, the session is being recorded. Donc, je le dis en français aussi, de vous rappeler que la session est en train d'être enregistrée et que d'ailleurs, elle va être mise en ligne dans 24 heures. Donc, vous pourrez la revoir. I say that in English. The session will be available as of tomorrow, and so you can go back to check if there's anything that you missed in the present presentation. So our first speaker this morning is going to be Wanessa Asfora Nadler. It's a great pleasure to be welcoming you. She's an historian working on medieval food history and the history of medicine. Currently, she's a research collaborator for the XIIe Heritage Project at the Center for Classical and Humanistic Studies at the University of Coimbra in Portugal. And she's also a coordinator of the Latim at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Wanessa, take it away.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everybody. In ancient and medieval texts, the recipe understood as a brief form that presents a succession of ingredients and procedures to be followed, as proposed by Bruno Loriot in 1997, is often placed at the crossroads of dietetics, pharmacology, and cooking. By observing, for example, how the doctor prescribes the use of a particular recipe in dietetics therapy, it's possible to raise questions about the circumscriptions of the dietary and the culinary knowledge and how they are put into practice in specific historical settings. I intend to approach issues like these using Marsilio Ficino's Consilio contro la pestilentia as my main source and to get closer to the context of the Second Plague pandemic. This is a new research, recently started, so this communication will be the very first opportunity to share with you a work in progress. I have set three main objectives for the research as a whole. First, to verify the role played by food in the therapy against the plague. Second, to analyze food preparation procedures in the recipes in order to individuate the existence of a possible culinary component. And third, to deepen the reflection on the relationship between theory and practice related to food, crossing data in the Consilio contro la pestilentia and other 15th and early 16th century Italian textual and iconographical sources, directly or indirectly related to the plague. Today, I will focus on just a few ideas related to the objectives number 1 and 2. The Consilio contro la pestilentia was written by Marsilio Ficino, one of the most famous humanists and physicians of the second half of the 15th century in Italy. He wrote in the context of a new outbreak of the Second Plague pandemic that ravaged Florence again in the years 1478 and 1480. The work is thus born with a strong practical character, although one can identify information coming from a more theoretical background in its argumentation, particularly when Ficino dialogues with his ancient and medieval medical and philosophical sources. The Consilio was written in the Tuscan language, which evidences Ficino's intention to reach both the professional doctor and the common reader. The dissemination of Ficino's ideas presented in the Consilio was boosted by the circulation of the first printed editions and the rise of new studies on plague diseases on the 16th century. The work was published for the first time in Florence in 1481, and 7 new reprints were printed in the 16th century. Since then, the Consilio became a reference, excuse me, much corroborated or discussed by the 16th century physicians. The text is organized into a small prologue and 23 chapters dealing essentially with the definition of the plague, its characteristics, signs, and therapy. Advice against the pestilence is roughly part of a wide genre of medical literature called consilia. The medical consilium is usually a tripartite text in which the first part is dedicated to identifying the patient's case and the second and the third parts to the appropriate therapy to cure the disease in question. The consilia against the plague are usually slightly different in form because they tend to focus on cure and therapy. The need to find effective solutions in the fight against the disease, which in the 15th century remained a deadly threat, forced doctors to rethink and rework urgently and attentively the current medical theories, many of which had already proved to be ineffective, in order to formulate and prescribe adequate recommendations to the patients. Ficino's knowledge of pestilentia, the disease caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis, is essentially that one shared by his contemporaries and even by his predecessors, such as Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna, and Gentil da Foligno. That is to say, he believes pestilentia was a type of plague, like those described in ancient medical literature, but with exceptional virulence. The pestilentia is born of the air. It's a specific kind of poison, a poisonous vapor, harmful to the vital spirit. When a woman or a man is contaminated by the plague, inside the body, a battle between the disease and the vital spirits takes place. This battle gives life to the body and, accordingly to the Ficinian conception, also to the soul. Curiously, the vital spirit is also a type of vapor generated by the most subtle part of the blood in the heart. The constitution of the two vapors are practically opposite in the proportion of their qualities: coldness, heat, dryness, and humidity. For this reason, the strategies put into action to combat the plague found in the text are usually strategies for managing the contact of the human bodies with those four qualities in a positive way. In the context of the plague, more than ever, bodies should be taken care of so as not to weaken and open themselves up to illnesses. The health of the body was basically maintained through the precepts of the ancient dieta, rules of life, grounded in the ancient and medieval medical tradition. Among these precepts, to avoid excess, to keep the body closed or protect, and to stay away from heat and humidity are the dominant advices in the text. To reflect on culinary knowledge, I will focus almost exclusively on the recommendations found in Chapter 5 on diet, or Come si conserva dalla peste per regola di vita. If we take into account the usual definition for recipe, as for example, the definition proposed by Bruno Loriot mentioned before, we can count only one recipe in Chapter 5 with its variation. The great majority of recipes in stricto sensu is found in chapters devoted exclusively to the care of the sick, like Chapter 6, Come si conserva dalla peste per modo medicinale, Chapter 7, della cura secondo la fisica, and Chapter 8, del cibare e governo dello infermo. In these cases, we have lists of ingredients with or without precise measurement indications, the list of ingredients necessary to prepare medicinal composites, of which the teriaca, the famous anti-poison remedy of antiquity, was undoubtedly the most efficient one. This was indeed to be expected in a text whose primary nature is undoubtedly medical. Our proposal, however, is to try to read between the lines, if I may say so, in search of what I believe exists in this kind of medical writing, even if we do not find the canonical formal structure of a text recipe. In other words, I believe something of the culinary knowledge of the time might be presented in a more fluid text that proposes or recommends the use of a certain type of culinary procedures in order to transform the qualitative attributes of a certain type of food or food preparation. From now on, I will be referring to this fluid text as recommendations. According to the text, heat and humidity are qualities that contribute to the opening of the body's pores, which facilitates its weakening through the escape of vital fluids, and also to the alteration of the body humors, facilitating putrefaction and the consequent deterioration of the bodies. Following this logic, Ficino's general rule is to stay away of food ingredients or preparations that are hot or humid, especially those which are excessively hot and humid. Heat and humidity in food should be avoided or at least minimized through the act of making the right food choices, of course, and two, performing operations of corrections. Making the right food choices involves a knowledge or a know-how based in two aspects. Provenance, ingredients should come from arid, aromatic, and high places like hills and mountains. Ingredients with these oranges should be used as abundantly as possible. And qualities, the qualities of ingredients. It is necessary here to recognize which ingredients are prevalently hot, like salt, meat, certain types of spices and herbs, strong sauces or sauces that are too acid or citric, and certain types of wine. And also to recognize the humid ingredients like milk and ricotta, certain types of fish, and viscous sweets, and not to use them all. In case it's really necessary to consume such ingredients, the general indication is to do it in very small quantities. Otherwise, their undesirable qualities may cause excess of blood and cholera and the consequent putrefaction and inflammation of the body. Chapter 5 presents in a not very organized way a number of food items to be consumed, to be avoided, and also to be corrected. At the moment, I'm working the systematization of all the food items mentioned in that chapter by categories. For time's sake, and also because I would like to deepen this study before presenting it, the discussion of the categories and their problematics will be left for another time. So let's proceed now to talk a little bit about the second point related to the necessity of minimizing the negative effects of ingesting hot and or humid food items or food preparations. When it was not possible to make a proper choice, it was necessary to perform operations to correct the undesirable food qualities or to produce desirable ones. These operations are nothing more than culinary procedures. And the most effective of these culinary procedures mentioned in the text are roasting and flavoring. Roasting allows drying the food, as we know, extracting or balancing its humidity, and therefore, from the point of view of medicine, moral medicine, making it a safe food for individuals that should avoid or counterbalance humidity in food. In times of plague, this principle, instead of being directed to specific groups of individuals, is aimed to the general population as the everyday diet. A roast cuisine is highly recommended, although it's not possible to precise in the text if pan roasted or oven roasted. Soups or liquids, as juices, for example, appear only when it's necessary to treat those who were already sick. However, baking only is not enough. Flavoring is the fundamental culinary operation in the kitchen in times of pestilence. In Ficino's Consilio, the general recommendation is to cook or to correct food with good aromas, acid and salty sauces for hot items, or sugar in the case of too wet food items. This would solve three possible problems: to prevent the potential putrefaction of ingredients that may have been exposed to the pestilential vapors in nature, to purify the bodies, and also to purify the air. The preferable culinary preparations were then those that have acid or vinegary, sharp, or sugary flavors. I can give you two examples for this. First, the Ficino's recommendation on how to properly prepare fried fish. After being fried in oil, the fish should be put into liquids or sauces coming from grapes, acid grapes, or vinegar or bitter orange with salt and a bit of pepper and cinnamon. Second, his recommendation to eat ricotta as a first dish with sugar added on it. It is believed that these flavors could refresh, dry, preserve, and fortify the bodies. As we find in other similar medical writings, the mixes of herbs and spices to counteract the food qualities can be quite specific because they depend on many things and basically on the equation qualities of the food items and the consumer's profile. But in those difficult times, Ficino seems to want to make things easier for his contemporaries and recommends an useful recipe of mixed seasonings, a spezzeria, to be used in all kinds of dishes. 1/2 ounce of red sandalwood, 3.5 drachma of cinnamon, and 1/2 drachma of saffron. This is the only recipe in the stricto sensu Ficino includes in the chapter on diet, as I mentioned before. The recipe, as we can infer, even without going deep into the analysis of the mentioned plants, assemble three important properties that a good food in times of pestilence should have: aromatic, calorific, and astringent. To conclude this part, I would like to add a few words at the important aspect of flavoring highlighted in that part of the text, the aromatizing function. It is obviously difficult to think of a cuisine that is not aromatic. Every cuisine has its particular smells. However, in the case of the cuisine that seems to emerge from Ficino's text, the common denominator in the praised aroma is their sanitizing or their cleansing powers. In agreement with the relational logic that connects the micro and the macrocosmos, a kind of logic that plays an important role in the structure of medieval thought, food that smells good and emanates good odors contributes to cleaning the bodies and the air. So now to my closing remarks. More than final remarks, what I have here are questions, very broad and complex questions, you will see it. even though I consider important to share them with you because they are somehow guiding me through this new research at this very beginning phase. First, as in non-epidemic times, the role of food remains an essential part to guaranteed health. The difference, it seems, lies in a closer observance of one type of food diet with common characteristics aimed to everyone who was not sick. Perhaps the more individualized traits that characterize the food diet based on the rules of medicine are alleviated or relaxed in favor of a diet that is moderate in quantity, prevalently dry and cold, and odoriferous. Here, a question which is not particularly new should be reconsidered. To what extent this relaxation of the guiding medical precepts in food recommendations would have influenced medieval food tastes and the medieval food cuisine? 2. Taking into consideration the canonical definition of recipe or definitions of recipe, it has to be admitted that recipes presented in the chapter on diet of Ficino's Consilio are an exception. The highest incidence of what I call recommendation is a more proper thing to consider. Even though in these recommendations, it's quite clear the proximity with the culinary domain or cuisine if we prefer, since there are two culinary procedures that would allow adjusting the diet in times of plague, roasting and flavoring. These were culinary procedures aimed to prepare dishes that maintain or produce astringency, dryness, and the freshness of the body, avoiding the fearful humidity that would lead to their internal putrefaction. The question that arises from this point is it possible that a roasting and cleansing aromatic cuisine might have been more appreciated and sought after in times of plague? Considering that that second plague pandemic was quite long and functioned as a kind of background for the social and cultural life from the mid-14th century on, we could hypothesize about its relation to the culinary options that characterize the cuisine of the late Middle Ages and the one from early modern period. In other words, is it reasonable to ask to what extent the second plague pandemic could be considered as an event of medium durée, which influenced the culinary options from the 14th century on? Or more specifically, what was the role of the second plague pandemic and the dietary recommendations stemming from it to the slow and complex process of construction of the cuisine of the late Middle Ages? I'm not trying to say medieval cuisine and even early modern cuisine was a simple derivative, a byproduct of the medicine of those times. On the contrary, I'm just thinking that perhaps we historians have not yet reflected deeply enough on how the different rhythms of the pandemic influenced the long and complex process of transformation, from ancient to medieval to early modern cooking and cuisine. But as it has been proved by the presentations in this symposium, we are living a very special moment when the already non-cookbooks and recipes are being reassessed through new manuscripts, and even new cookbooks and recipes are being discovered. Given this, to come back to the old chicken or egg dilemma of the influence of medicine in cuisine or vice versa makes sense to me. To my research, particularly having all these questions in the horizon, helps me to build a methodological framework where to place the comparative study I intend to make to achieve the third objective of my research. It's a work in progress, as I said before, that will certainly benefit from the results of the CoReMA project and from any comments or critiques you would like to make. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wanessa, for your being on time also, and for this very concise view of of Marsilio Ficino's Consilio contro la pestilentia. I think Virginie can probably have several questions for you already.
Yes, thank you. I have first question from Beatrice Reynaud. Sugar considered as a spice, is it considered as medicine? The fact that we often find the mention of sugar in research for patients. So is the question from sugar, is it a spice or did we use all the time spice with medicine?
Thank you, Beatrice, for your question. If I understood it clearly, I think you would like to know if in the case of the text, the Consilio, sugar was used as a medicine or as a spicy. Well, I can tell you in this case, in the case of this text, is also used to transform food in the chapter related to diet, to the food recommendations for people who are not sick already. So sugar is used to transform the qualities and to make the quality of the food preparation, the dish, more suitable, not to make the body more suitable, not to weaken the body, to open the body to the danger of the plague. So in this case, I would say, in this specific part of the text, I would say sugar is used as a spicy that helps to season, to temperate the food, not as a single medicine, an individuate medicine. But in the chapters regarding to medicines, because there are mainly 3 chapters full of recipes of medicinal compounds, sugar appears in a different context, like a medical ingredient, I would say, together with other medicinal ingredients. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yes, I think. I have another question from Antoine Soulier. You show a recipe with precision relative to measure of quantity. Is it possible to find this kind of pretension only on medical culinary book, or is it specific to this book? So about the measure and the quantity in your book, is it all the time culinary recipe or also cooking recipe?
I'm sorry, Virginie, could you repeat the last part again?
So Antoine Soulier asks you if when you have the measure and quantity in your recipe, is it all the time with medical culinary book or is also with other book?
Okay, thank you, Antoine. I'm just trying to understand the last part. Is it possible to find this kind of presentation only in medical culinary book? Well, the use of measurement, precise measurements and quantities are more common in medical recipes. But we can find it in culinary books, well, the ones that I have more familiarity with. But generally, the specific measurements indications are more common in medical recipes. In the case of the Consilio, when we are working in the chapters dealing with the recipes for medicinal composites, we find many recipes with measurements. Maybe the majority of them include measurements. But when we are dealing with more culinary recommendations, the ones that I mentioned that are more present in chapter 5, we don't find measurements, precise measurements, except that one that I showed for the spezzeria.
Thank you. Now I have a question from Marie Iman about the roasting. Is it pan roasting or oven roasting? Do they especially mention oven roasting or it's only roast?
Only roast. I need, thank you, Mary, for your question. I need to, as I said before, I'm working the systematization of all the information and the details in regarding each food items or each food preparation. But at the moment, so far, I cannot precise if they are pan roasted or oven roasted. The texts are very confused sometimes, and Ficino, especially in the culinary recommendations, Ficino goes on and back. And so we need really to do a detailed analysis to try to apprehend this information if we can. So I cannot precise this for now.
No, I see that Bruno, you have a question.
Yes, sorry. You hear me, no?
Yes, we do.
Yes, I don't know if you see me because I have a problem. So thank you, Wanessa, for your very interesting communication. I wonder one thing. When you speak about second pandemic plague, it's the black pest, simply, no? Or is it? Yes. So from the 14th century on.
Exactly. I'm thinking. I'm trying to think to contextualize the production of these texts from the Black Death on, because as the medical historians, medieval historians at the moment are working more in this long durée of the pandemics, they are considering not the Black Death as singling out this event, but putting it in a more broad context. So the worst outbreak, which was the Black Death, and the subsequent ones that happened in different rhythms in different parts of Europe. So trying to put this text and its contemporaries text in this whole context, trying to see if it's possible to see if there was any relation with this urge, this necessity to deal with the disease with the recommendations that use culinary procedures.
So maybe you have a project, a broad project on all the pest tracts that were produced in huge numbers from the 14th century. It would be really interesting if you could, maybe not alone, but if you could study all this huge material, which has not been really exploited, studied in a comprehensive way.
Yes, Bruno, you're right, because this idea started as a very small project just to study Ficino's and his more close peers, the ones that wrote about the plague in central Italy. But now I'm really interested in this topic, and I'm trying to build a more enlarged corpus for a more enlarged durée, and trying to see this in a more systematized way. More or less to point this in the medium durée, as I said, in the Brudelian sense of the term. Yes, and of course this is huge. I don't have the probably I will make a lot of cuts in my original idea, because the number of tracks are, as you said, enormous. But let's see if I can deal with that, at least for the first part of it.
I'm going to interrupt you because time is running on. I had a question too, but it's too late to do it. I will do it privately with you. It has to do with, why did he write it in Italian rather than in Latin? Because I think that's a sort of an interesting point that I'm sure you could develop. But unfortunately, we have to move on. And so our next speaker is going to be Jens Eike Schnall, who is Associate Professor of Old Norse Studies at the University of Bergen in Norway. And he holds a DPhil in Scandinavian and German Studies from the University of Göttingen. his research interests lie predominantly in medieval and early modern studies, and they include medieval and early modern food cultures, encyclopedic literature, science and technology, mapping and cartography, learned networks, as well as medievalism and nation building in 19th and 20th century Scandinavia and Germany.
Thanks for the kind introduction, and especially thanks to the organizers and the speakers, also for not just arranging this beautiful conference, but also for having me, because I am not concluding a research project. I'm rather at the start. I'm going to look more closely into the recipe literature of medieval Scandinavia, and this is a very superb opportunity for me to connect to your research that gives my own a significant boost. So thanks a lot. And I plunge into my paper. The Doctor's Diet could be read with a question mark. I deal with culinary recipes in medieval Scandinavia. And the funny thing is we have 3 recipe collections at different times. One from around 1300, a Danish one, today kept at the Copenhagen Royal Library. Another one roughly 100 years younger, also Danish, and an Icelandic one from the end of the 15th century. I'm looking more closely into these 3 to give you one perspective to these collections of recipes. I just want to quote Timothy Tomasek in his article Cookbooks in the Handbook of Medieval Studies. He subsummarizes, as you can see, the earliest manuscript collections of recipes are often short, often lack a clear title or clear divisions and rubrics, and are often inserted within codices, having no other relevance to food and cuisine. I just want to check how things are concerning our Danish and Icelandic manuscripts. Let's have a look. One to the left, the K, is the oldest Danish. The Q in the middle is the younger Danish, and the one to the right is the Icelandic. You could see here, it is rather the opposite concerning the Danish oldest manuscript. And if we look at these manuscripts as a whole, you could say that the medieval North provides a learned, sorry for my English, a learned way into the recipe literature, both in the way the manuscript is made and, as we will see, also concerning the languages. The medieval North is not characterized by such a rich tradition of recipes as, for example, the German-speaking areas. These 3 manuscripts I show you are actually the only ones we know from medieval Scandinavia. There is a 4th manuscript, which I also will deal with very briefly, namely a Middle Low German one, kept in Wolfenbüttel. I said we have these recipe collections from 3 different times, but actually it's more or less renderings, versions of one and the same original collection of recipes that have been transmitted through medieval Scandinavia. Until very recently, the oldest Danish one was thought of being one of the oldest, perhaps the oldest, vulgar recipe collections of the Middle Ages, but this was rejected, for example, by Bruno Loriot, and thus quoted in the edition of the recipes by Grew and Hyatt in 2001. Let's have a look at the individual manuscripts. And what I'm going to do is I want to look at the recipe collections from a manuscript context and a compilation perspective. So here, marked in red, we find the Cookery book and the oldest Danish recipe collection, inserted in a codex that mainly contains the works of Henrik Harpestring. He was a Danish physician. We do not know much about him. He is the only Danish physician known abroad. He died on April the 2nd, 1244, as a canon in Roskilde, and it is clear that he must have studied abroad. It is assumed that he might have been to Salerno, and on a very unsafe basis, he is identified, or has been identified, with a certain Magister Henricus Dacus, from whom two works survive in several 15th century manuscripts, Latin works. Work on laxatives, De Simplicibus Medicinis Laxativis, and an herbal, Liber Herbarum. He has probably dwelt at Orléans and perhaps been the personal physician to King Erik IV of Denmark, also called Erik Plaupenny. Harpestring's other works, as we find in the Codex NKS 66 here, are written in Danish, or Older Middle Danish to be more precise. The Book of Herbs is actually two books of herbs, which are clearly separated by incipit and explicits. Yeah, and this cookbook, for some reason, has been regarded as a later addition, not belonging to the original Harpestring's works, which is interesting because we have the very oldest text witness here containing it, and as we'll see, written by one scribe, all put together very neatly around 1300. The main text of K, as I said, is in Old Danish, but rubrics and paratexts are in Latin, as is, and in addition, it contains numerous Middle Low German and other loanwords. It clearly shows multilingual features, usually associated with translation and transmissions. You see the parts here, and looking at the time, I just speed up a bit. The whole codex, as I said, was written and diligently written by one scribe who spectacularly identifies himself here, namely as Brother Knud Jul, at the end of the first herbal. And perhaps once more at the end of the cookbook, but there was an erasure. With a very diligent mise en page and writing, initials, titles, incipits, and explicits being in red, blue, and green, it is far more elaborately decorated, as Grieco and Hyatt point out, than most early cookery manuscripts. K contains 25 recipes for walnut and almond oil, butter, milk and milk pie, for several sauces to be served with different types of fish and meat, for mush and pasties, and for several chicken dishes. The title is given both in the incipit and the explicit and starts in the following way. Incipit libellus de arte coquinaria, quomodo fiat oleum de nucibus. Is the first thing you can see this at the upper right side. We have a look at the next one. The next manuscript is actually a very brief one, and this is due to the fact that the 5 folio it contains had been taken out of a larger codex, which now is in Stockholm, and it contains the Code of Jutland and some additions. And it can be seen that where this codex ends, the C41, in the middle of a text that is a royal decree from 1251, exactly there, the 5 leaves now in Copenhagen start, so it is clear that this layer has been taken out. And on these 5 pages, we get 31 recipes in NKS 70R. there is considerable overlap. They share 21 recipes. And if one looks at the texts, one immediately gets the idea that these are independent translations of two closely related sources, such as the first editor of the work has pointed out, Christensen in 1908. There are significant differences. For example, this manuscript does not have the rubrics in Latin as the older Danish version. We have to assume that the scribe made different choices and might even at times have copied the older or the common urtext, as Greve and Hyatt call it, more diligently than the K text. We have another version, now not Danish, but Icelandic, from the end of the 15th century. And this is written in Icelandic, as it says, and it has also the harp-string herbal, the lapidary, and the cookbook, as K has. One has to assume that there was a Norwegian intermediary, which is now lost. D, in contrast to the younger Danish one, keeps the Latin titles and also keeps some Low German recipe titles, though often in a way that one has to assume that they were not really appropriately understood. I give you one example here. The camelline sauce has been mentioned before in the conference, and here we have it in the oldest version I show you. It doesn't have the title camelline sauce. Here it is called a lordly sauce. That herreseltzer, as it said, and the Latin title calls it salsum dominorum. Yeah, a lordly sauce. The recipe is short. I read it to you. One takes cloves and nutmeg, cardamom, pepper, cinnamon, that is cannel, and ginger, all in equal amounts, except that there should be as much cannel as all the other spices, and add twice as much toasted bread as of everything else, and grind them all together, and blend with strong vinegar, and place it in a cask. This is a lordly sauce, and it is good for half a year. We have actually seen you acting this out. This was a pleasure to watch. The next recipe tells us what to do with this sauce, so that you could dress and preserve meat when you put it into the sauce. The problem with the otherwise practical edition of these three texts and the Low German one by Greve and Hyatt from 2001, which is stupendously annotated, so there's very good commentaries. There's just one problem which directly affects our area here, namely when we are looking for small signs how the recipes were perceived in a dietary context. Remarks that were reflecting possible dietetic or other uses of these recipes come last in the recipes. So the very last sentences are of interest. And here we see some mistranslations and misconceptions. I just give you one example here. And this I say not because I want to criticize this edition. This is more, one has to be aware when one uses this otherwise very useful book when it comes to details. Here, in a recipe of a rather simple sauce, which is a salsa of minimal cost, the recipe runs as follows. One should take onions and chop them as small as peas and the same amount of parsley, and pour in some broth and add a fourth part of vinegar. These sauces are for simple people, the text reads in the translation. But it doesn't say that. It says, Feste Salse säljer, which has to be translated as people sell this sauce or these sauces. And if we look at the parallel version in the Younger Danish manuscript, that is Q here, then it says, "Then salser got vägfarent men." This source is good for traveling people. But traveling people cannot just be understood like vagabonds, poor people. It can cover this, but it is a neutral term. It is people on their way, also meaning merchants. For example, Israeli merchants in a Danish Bible translation, and old Danish Bible translations are called vägfarent here. So for some reason, it is mentioned that this was a good source for these. Perhaps it keeps well. So we could, which I cannot do here today because of time, look at these very last sentences, and I will do a bit of that when wrapping up my lecture in a sec. Not before we have looked at an interesting version that could point back to an intermediary in Low German. It has been speculated on the basis of the many Low German recipe names that the collection was transmitted via a Low German urtext. I say we have to bear in mind that the realm of Denmark was at least trilingual when it comes to the better educated. That is, apart from Danish, of course, Latin, but also Low German. Law texts and other texts were often quite early translated into Low German. So it could actually have originated also in the Danish realm, just to say that. Here we have a 15th century Low German manuscript that contains medical texts and a cookery book. Also other recipes, and both in Low and in High German. You will find here it is 103 recipes in these codex, but now let's have a look at just part of the incipits of the recipes. The editors of the three Scandinavian texts and this one pointed out that here between recipe number 56 and 72 in the Low German Codex, the incipit changes. It had been very regularly in the first instances, just with very few exceptions, namely will to maken, item, will to maken, if you want to make. This changes here for some recipes, namely, now we get imperatives like nim, take, or men shall nemen, one should take. And this is exactly the section where we have an overlap with the Scandinavian recipes and the Low German ones. Thus, it very much looks like that here, this section resembles a collection that was the basis for all four manuscripts I mentioned in my talk today. I'm not going to dwell on this, but as the thing is recorded, and if you want to have a closer look, you can just look this up again. Here, it is shown how the urtext numbers and the individual collections look like. I'm not going into the urtext debate here. It is a practical thing that the editors just have numbered the recipe so it's easy to compare. And what is most striking is one feature. K, Q, and D have pretty much the same order of recipes. That's very consistent. And W has not. There is a certain there is a certain order here, as you see in the right margin, but there's also some rearrangement or another order of recipes. So here, there's clearly the biggest divide between the four manuscripts, 3 against 1. I jump to my conclusions. And yes, I would like that, but I lost them here either. I start with the recipes and we'll have a focus on the dietary embedding. First, concerning the recipes, the organization are by ingredients, which can be clearly seen in the almond section, because there appears a pie. Otherwise, you could have thought, well, first we have some produce that is reused in some recipes as almond milk, and then some sauces, and then some chicken dishes. But here we clearly see, due to the almond pie, that the thought was ingredients. We have no direct reference to diet that is 100% clear. We have references to economics. That is, how long does a dish or a sauce keep, which is also partly in the title. We have references to users, namely, this sauce is sold by people, or this is good for traveling people. We have a certain way of presenting amounts. These are relative amounts in parts. So like take 1 part of this and 7 parts of that. The time is not given, just by result. Stir until it thickens. What we have, though, and now we actually approaching the dietary context of this, is very few remarks on consumption. Namely, this chicken is good to eat warm. Or, and again, we encounter a problem in the translation. This stirs the appetite. Had been mistranslated. This is good to eat, but one's recipe has stirs the appetite, which is the same one between the 2 versions, K and Q, namely recipe 22, if you want to look it up. What we often have is a very unspecific, this is good. And good could mean preservation, it could be taste, it could be digestion, or it could also be health effects. And now my main point, and by this I conclude, is that as you have seen in the synopsis of the contents, in 3 cases, namely K, D, and W, that is the oldest Danish, the Icelandic, and the Low German versions, we have a very clear context of a clear medical context. That is a combination of the herbal and the lapidary, and then the cookbook in the oldest Danish manuscript and the Icelandic. That is, the information about digestion, about health effects is already given. For example, when it says about cinnamon, one of the standard sentences, it makes the food melt in your stomach. Yeah? Then the information is already given in the manuscript context, so there was no literal need for this to be repeated in a recipe. It is clear for the user. And this is also helped, and we see user marks by rubrics in the margin, or margins, or commentaries in the margins. So I just put some literature in this presentation, so you see some of it. And I leave it there and wait for questions. Thanks for me.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. But at the moment, I don't have a question for you.
It's all fine.
I can't start my video because the host is not letting me do that. But in any case, I was fascinated by your uncovering the cameline sauce even in Iceland, because of course the cameline sauce is a real European standard, and I find them all the time in Italy. They're well known in France, but who would have guessed that they got all the way to Iceland? So I'm wondering whether there are other examples of really European-wide recipes that you are finding in your sources.
Yes, actually they are. And the camelline sauce is a good example because you have the three very standard all European recipes there for sauces or dressings, if you wish. You have the camelline, you have the green sauce, and you have mustard, all contained here and very much in line with what is to be found elsewhere. So this is interesting also to me because we have such an early vulgar example of this in Danish. And I was a bit puzzled. Why not the name? I mean, otherwise the connection is so observant about the names, but camelline has not been rendered here. If we would look again at the recipe, we would find that it is quite in line with what the statutes of, I think it's late 14th century Paris says about the camelline sauce, where there's a prescription what it has to contain. So it is based on vinegar in our Danish cookbook here, not on wine. And I think that's what in these statutes has to be found. So it's a very international thing, the recipe collection. Otherwise, sure, I could go on, but time will not be there or to trace what is internationally accessible of the recipe collection.
Yeah, but we have a question from Bruno Loriot.
Mm-hmm. Just a suggestion for you. You hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Yes. I was very interested with your new translation of the recipe. For the sauce is good for traveling people. It's very important because we have in Latin, in the 14th century, a cookbook, whose name is Modus Viaticorum Preparandorum Salsarum, etc. So Viaticorum, that means food for travelers.
Yeah. So
maybe it was published in an unpublished thesis, PhD, unfortunately, the one of Carole Lambert, or maybe you can compare to see if there is a link, because I think your treatise is even if it's not from 12th century as we thought originally, it's an old one of the oldest ones. So it needs to be compared with the Durham manuscript and with also this manuscript in Latin mixed with Occitan.
Yes, thanks you so much, and I really would love to do this, and I'm also very grateful for this for your remark concerning this traveler's recipe thing. That is great. So as I initially said, I'm just at the start of my journey here, and I also will make another go. I'm not the first to see what might be the closest collection of recipes the Grieco and Hyatt have tried, and well, we have to see, because I think the CoReMA project and your work is an excellent basis to make another go and see how far this gets us. So I'm super interested in pursuing this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eike. I'm afraid we have to keep moving because we're running out of time. Et donc, maintenant, on passe au français parce que la prochaine personne qui va parler, c'est Madeleine Ferrières, qui nous va parler sur une recette dans le Platine en François. Et les professeurs d'histoire moderne à l'Université d'Avignon étaient honoraires rattachés au labo de recherche TELEM de Aix-en-Provence. Elle a travaillé sur les sensibilités et les comportements alimentaires, les peurs, et aujourd'hui sur la construction des cuisines régionales, et donc d'un point de vue occitan. Donc, Madeleine, je te passe la parole.
Bonjour et merci de m'avoir invité malgré mon incompétence en anglais. Donc, diapo suivante, s'il vous plaît, Christophe. Je vais vous parler d'une recette d'un livre que beaucoup connaissent, c'est le Platine en français. On sait qu'à Lyon, en 1505, François Fradin fait paraître ce livre dont le succès éditorial est bien connu, 21 ou 23 rééditions entre 1505 et 1588. Le Platine en français s'avère un des best-sellers de la Renaissance française. Si Platine lui-même, c'est-à-dire Bartolomeo Sacchi, est un personnage dont on connaît bien la vie et la carrière de polygraphe, en revanche, du traducteur de 1505, on ne sait rien, sinon ce qu'il dit lui-même au début du livre, diapo suivante. Au début de son prologue, on le voit, il s'annonce, il s'appelle Didier Cristol et il habite à Montpellier. Ma proximité géographique avec les archives montpelliéraines m'a incité à enquêter sur ce mystérieux Didier Cristol. Les quelques traces que j'ai pu mettre à jour me semblent intéressantes pour éclairer les conditions de production de cet ouvrage. Et pour aller tout de suite à ma conclusion, il me semble que le contexte de production de cet ouvrage confirme parfaitement les liens entre médecine et alimentation que la lecture même de l'ouvrage laisse déjà entrevoir. Donc, d'abord sur Didier Cristol lui-même. Platine n'était ni médecin ni cuisinier. Cristol n'est pas cuisinier, il est médecin et il est chanoine. Voilà pourquoi d'ailleurs il a cet avant-titre de messire. Il appartient à un chapitre de Montpellier et pas n'importe quel chapitre, le plus important, le chapitre cathédral. Il fait partie de ce petit cercle d'humanistes qui gravitent autour de l'évêque Guillaume Pélissier. Il est médecin aussi, et là, le cursus universitaire est beaucoup plus difficile à reconstituer, dans la mesure où j'ai trouvé peu de sources continues. À l'école de médecine, par exemple, le registre matricule de l'université n'est conservé qu'à partir de 1510. En revanche, c'est dans les archives de l'hôtel de ville que j'ai trouvé quelques indices précieux. La première mention que j'ai relevée sur lui, c'est dans les comptes de la Claverie de 1477, où il est qualifié de magistère, c'est-à-dire de maître, et d'étudiant. On peut supposer donc qu'il est majeur et il serait donc né dans les années 1450. La seconde mention, c'est 20 ans après, si on peut passer à la diapo suivante. C'est un manifeste de 1497. Un manifeste, c'est-à-dire une déclaration de patrimoine. Et on voit qu'au premier paragraphe, il déclare premièrement un hôtel en l'Aiguillerie. La rue de l'Aiguillerie, c'est la rue la plus huppée de Montpellier. Et j'ai pu deviner que le profil de Cristol n'est pas du tout un profil à la Rabelais, chanoine bien entendu, médecin tous les deux, mais Cristol n'est pas du tout un moine gyrovague, c'est quelqu'un de bien enraciné, de bien installé dans la bourgeoisie et dans le patriciat montpelliérain, et il a hérité cet hôtel de son père qui était un riche marchand montpelliérain. Alors, la note marginale est difficile à déchiffrer, mais elle est très intéressante parce que c'est là qu'on voit qu'il est mentionné comme étudiant et fréquentant les studi. Et on sait qu'il doit approcher quand même les 50 ans. C'est assez étonnant de savoir qu'il a repris les chemins de l'université 20 ans après. En même temps, cette note est là pour lui faire bénéficier du dégrèvement fiscal que la municipalité accorde à tous les étudiants ou les docteurs en médecine. Et puis en dessous commence, on voit second paragraphe, les autres biens de nouveaux comprats, de nouveaux nouvellement achetés. Et on voit qu'effectivement, à partir de cette année 1497, il commence à acheter pas mal de biens fonciers, ce qui prouve un certain enrichissement dont nous allons parler dans un moment. Donc, on est en 1497 et ces années 1497-1498 sont vraiment des années très importantes pour la mise en œuvre du platine en français. C'est là où il y a une conjonction de deux événements majeurs. Le premier, c'est le moment où le roi Louis XII crée 4 régences à l'école de médecine, marquant ainsi un renouveau dans l'enseignement de la médecine à Montpellier. Il est certain que ces régents, nouvellement nommés, rétribués par le roi, ont cœur à asseoir leur réputation et la réputation aussi de leur école. On sait que cette réputation, depuis le Moyen-Âge, repose essentiellement sur la diététique. Montpellier a dans ses gènes une vocation diététique qui la distingue dans le royaume de l'autre grande école médicale, c'est-à-dire Paris. Pour continuer à faire vivre cet héritage médiéval, une difficulté surgit. C'est qu'il n'y a pas d'imprimerie à Montpellier, il n'y en aura jamais. L'obstacle est contourné grâce à une solide connexion établie entre les maîtres montpelliérains et les éditeurs lyonnais. Dès 1500, le marché du livre médical montpelliérain est à Lyon, en particulier autour des frères Fradin. Diapositive suivante. L'un des frères, Constantin, est très actif à Montpellier, où il a la clientèle des médecins, des professeurs, mais aussi du clergé. François, son frère, dont on voit la marque, est imprimeur à Lyon, et il a lancé une collection de livres médicaux puisés dans le fonds diététique montpelliérain et traduits par des montpelliérains. On voit ce que François Fradin a trouvé à Montpellier, c'est-à-dire une ville peuplée de maîtres et d'écoliers qui sont grands consommateurs de livres et qui, en plus, constituent un vivier d'érudits capables de prêter main forte à ses activités éditoriales en lui proposant des manuscrits, en les traduisant, en corrigeant ses épreuves. Et ce qui est important, c'est que c'est dans cette collection lancée par Fradin que le platine en français va paraître. On voit donc que ce n'est pas du tout une œuvre isolée, mais Platine en français s'inscrit dans une stratégie éditoriale. D'ailleurs, si on le compare à la traduction en français du régime de santé d'Arnaud de Villeneuve, qui est publié toujours à Lyon par ce même Fradin, qui a été publié 4 ans avant, on voit que les choix éditoriaux sont déjà arrêtés à ce moment-là et que les conventions se répètent d'un livre à l'autre. Dans ce contexte, il me semble que la traduction du platine est apparue sans doute aux Montpelliérains comme un enjeu fondamental pour pouvoir asseoir cette tradition diététique et en même temps pour renouveler les connaissances. Fondamental pour 2 raisons. La première, on le sait, c'est que le platine a des prétentions encyclopédiques. C'est un véritable dictionnaire des aliments et c'était l'occasion de récapituler toute la matière diététique. La seconde raison, diapo suivante, s'il vous plaît, si on voit ce sous-titre bien connu qui traite de honnête volupté, ça on peut dire que c'est un sous-titre qui convient parfaitement aux Montpelliérains, qui convient parfaitement à leur enseignement, parce qu'ils n'ont pas cessé d'enseigner une morale diététique assez aimable qui conjugue sans aucun conflit d'un côté le plaisir, en particulier le plaisir de manger, et puis de l'autre la santé. Et les Montpelliérains ont été toujours soucieux de délivrer des préceptes assez souples pour être obéis. c'est dans la tradition de la médecine pratique de Montpellier que d'avoir ce souci de l'observance de l'adhésion, comme on dirait aujourd'hui, du patient. Et on sait qu'en retour, c'est ce souci qui a nourri les critiques de leurs confrères parisiens qui n'avaient pas assez de mots pour taxer leurs collègues montpelliérains de laxisme, de suivisme et de conformisme. L'autre événement, si on peut bien passer à la diapo suivante, c'est beaucoup plus personnel, mais c'est selon moi étroitement corrélé à cette conjoncture médicale que je viens d'exposer. C'est qu'en 1498, Didier Cristol obtient le bénéfice du prieuré de Saint-Maurice. Alors Saint-Maurice de Sauray, près de Montpellier à l'époque de Cristol, maintenant dans l'agglomération même de Montpellier. Il y a d'ailleurs toujours un moulin à Sauray, au bord du Lez, qui est toujours en activité. Ce prieuré n'est pas un petit bénéfice. C'est le plus ancien établissement monastique de la ville, idéalement situé sur un riche terroir, au bord du Lez, la rivière que l'on voit ici, et qui assura longtemps la liaison entre Montpellier et la Méditerranée. Dans ce prieuré, il y a différents revenus, et en particulier 12 carterets de prairies inondées. C'est ce genre de terrain que, on le sait depuis les travaux de Leroy-Ladurie sur les compois de Montpellier, ce genre de terrain inondable que la bourgeoisie montpelliéraine s'arrache et que Cristol donc va pouvoir arrenter à très bon prix. Être prieur de Saint-Maurice, c'est disposer d'un prestige, de revenus très confortables et en contrepartie de charges pastorales très légères. De quoi vous inciter à reprendre les chemins de l'université et à travailler sous la férule de ses régents. De 1498 à 1506, l'heureux titulaire de ce bénéfice, c'est Didier Cristol. 8 ans, il faut 6 ans ou un peu plus pour achever un doctorat en médecine, présenter une thèse. Il a fallu sans doute aussi ce temps pour traduire, commenter et publier le Platine, si bien que ce bénéfice ecclésiastique, pour moi, a toutes les caractéristiques d'une bourse de recherche universitaire. Diapo suivante, s'il vous plaît. Je n'ai pas réussi à bien cadrer, excusez-moi, mais c'est à la fin du livre où, en nous indiquant qu'il est titulaire de Saint-Maurice, prieur de Saint-Maurice, en nous indiquant qu'il a travaillé avec d'autres docteurs de l'université de Montpellier, des médecins qu'on peut, me semble-t-il, rapprocher de ces nouveaux recteurs en poste à Montpellier. Je pense que Cristol nous a dit finalement l'essentiel sur les conditions d'élaboration de Platine placées sous le double patronage de l'école de médecine et de l'évêque. Pour moi, ce livre est issu d'un projet qui est piloté à la fois par l'université et par l'évêché, qui sont loin d'être deux entités, antithétiques, mais au contraire fortement interconnectées à Montpellier, à la fois socialement et institutionnellement. Donc, un livre médical avant tout. Cristol nous dit qu'il a copieusement augmenté la version originale, et c'est vrai. Le livre 2505, sa traduction, contient près de 800 000 signes, quand l'original latin n'atteint pas les 300 000. Cette augmentation est d'autant plus remarquable qu'elle concerne principalement la première partie du livre, c'est-à-dire la partie franchement diététique, sous forme d'additions, de commentaires ou même de nouvelles rubriques. C'est donc, il a procédé à toute une mise à jour de la matière diététique telle qu'elle était enseignée à ce moment-là à Montpellier. En revanche, dans la dernière partie, celle qui est la plus connue, la partie culinaire, il est très peu intervenu. L'intérêt secondaire qu'il semble porter aux recettes est tout à fait compréhensible. Tout l'équilibre du livre, d'ailleurs, reflète les représentations médicales de l'époque, quand les médecins montpelliérains disent et répètent « la cuisine est la servante de la médecine ». Et par ailleurs, pourquoi retoucher les recettes du Platine original? Ce sont des recettes d'origine italienne, mais aussi catalane, et c'est un syncrétisme culinaire qui convient tout à fait au Languedoc littoral où se situe Montpellier, qui a toujours été à la jonction entre les influences italiennes et les influences catalanes. Donc, deux nouvelles recettes seulement, l'une courte, qu'il appelle une sauce muscade, et l'autre beaucoup plus longue, diapo suivante, qui s'appelle pour cuire un chapon ou un cuisseau, c'est-à-dire un gigot, à l'étouffée. Alors pourquoi ces deux ajouts? Je voudrais savoir le sens de l'intervention de Cristol, qui fait qu'à ce moment-là, il passe du statut de simple traducteur ou simple commentateur à un statut d'auteur. Alors, je me suis dit dans un premier temps que peut-être ces recettes avaient une valeur diététique particulière. Mais je pense qu'il faut renoncer à cette hypothèse. Toutes les recettes dans le Platine sont assorties d'un commentaire diététique. Ici, le commentaire est très favorable, mais c'est ce qui arrive aussi dans beaucoup d'autres recettes. La seule chose qu'on peut noter, un peu subtile, si vous voulez, l'avis qu'il donne à la fin de cette recette de chapon, c'est la façon dont il ordonne ses jugements. Il nous dit, à la fin, c'est une viande fort délicieuse, donc d'abord l'avis d'un gastronome, proto-gastronome, une viande fort délicieuse, saine et bonne pour la santé, c'est-à-dire qu'il fait passer la santé après le jugement hédoniste. Je pense donc que ce n'est pas l'hypothèse diététique qui est la bonne. Peut-être invoquer un souci qu'il a tout le temps de réactualisation. C'est le cas, par exemple, pour la sauce muscade, qui apparaît comme une nouvelle version de cette cameline dont vous venez de dire, Alain et l'orateur précédent, à quel point elle était répandue dans tout l'espace européen. La cameline, la sauce muscade de Cristol, met en valeur la noix muscade et la graine de paradis, c'est-à-dire deux épices à la mode, 1 once de cannelle et 11 de sucre, c'est-à-dire des doses tout à fait significatives de cette invasion sucrière de la cuisine méridionale à la fin du Moyen-Âge, mise en évidence par Bruno Loriot. Ce n'est pas une sauce acide que l'on aurait édulcorée, mais à l'inverse, une sauce douce à laquelle on ajoute, in fine, un peu de vinaigre pour donner goût et pointe. Donc, c'est une version nouvelle d'une recette ultra classique du répertoire occidental. Ce qu'on ne peut absolument pas dire de cette recette que je vous présente. Ce qui frappe d'emblée en complète rupture avec les recettes originales de Saki, c'est la longueur de la formule, le soin de son développement et le souci des doses. On a l'impression de voir là Cristol, médecin, qui dicte sa recette comme on rédigerait une ordonnance. D'ailleurs, je crois que c'est le même mot à cette époque qu'on emploie. Mais plus que la modernité dans la forme, c'est la modernité du contenu lui-même qui m'interroge. Ce chapon ou mouton, cuisseau de mouton, à l'étouffée, c'est en fait ce qu'on appellerait aujourd'hui un tagine. Un tagine très sucré, lui aussi, avec des raisins de Corinthe, des dattes, des prunes sèches. Un tagine qui aurait été très décontextualisé et recontextualisé, puisque c'est un ragoût qui baigne dans le vin, le vinaigre, le jus de lard et le bouillon gras. Et non seulement il est épicé, très sucré, mais il est aromatisé avec les senteurs de la garrigue, puisqu'il y a du laurier, de la marjolaine, du serpolet. C'est donc un tagine qui aurait pris ses distances par rapport à la version originale jusque dans ses fonds de cuisson, puisqu'il transgresse deux interdits fondamentaux de l'islam, c'est-à-dire le lard et le vin. Je me demande si c'est un plat venu d'ailleurs qui a perdu son identité, ou bien si c'est un plat indigène dont le mode de préparation est tout à fait semblable à un tagine. Donc voilà l'alternative dans laquelle je me trouve. Soit un plat indigène, disons sans doute mieux un plat issu d'un fond commun pré-islamique. Je sais qu'il ne faut pas se laisser prendre au jeu d'étymologie, mais les linguistes nous apprennent que le mot berbère de tagine a son équivalent en grec classique et dans beaucoup de langues latines. Par exemple, c'est en Corse le tijanou, en Sicile le tiganou, et en occitan, nous avons le tian. Et le tian ressemble tout à fait au tagine en ce que ça désigne à la fois le récipient, le plat creux, son couvercle, et puis le contenu qu'il y a à l'intérieur. Ce rapprochement paraît d'autant plus légitime que le matériel et la technique de cuisson entrent tout à fait dans la pratique culinaire languedocienne de cette époque, me semble-t-il. D'abord, la cuisson à l'étouffée, qui semble exceptionnelle dans la cuisine du Nord, l'est beaucoup moins dans la cuisine méridionale. Et puis, dernière diapo, s'il vous plaît. Les archéologues ont pu répertorier à Montpellier, à la fin du Moyen-Âge, 55 formes de vaisselle régionale en terre pour la cuisson. Et parmi elles, on peut tout à fait repérer des récipients de type diable en argile cuite, avec des formes tronconiques qui rappellent tout à fait les plats à tagine que nous connaissons. Seulement voilà, les archéologues de Montpellier nous disent aussi que les échanges ont été constants entre les potiers de Montpellier et les faïenciers andalous, et que les potiers de Montpellier ont emprunté beaucoup de leurs modèles à leurs collègues de Valence, si bien que le contenant pose exactement le même problème que le contenu. Est-ce que c'est une production locale ou est-ce que c'est un transfert culturel? Donc, cette seconde hypothèse, c'est que Cristol donnerait une version occitane d'un plat emprunté au fond culinaire arabo-musulman. L'hypothèse de transfert culturel est d'autant plus possible qu'on est à Montpellier et qu'on sait que l'école de médecine de Montpellier n'a pas cessé d'entretenir tout au long du Moyen-Âge des relations scientifiques, et Montpellier elle-même, la ville des relations commerciales et culturelles très fortes et continues avec le monde ibérique. L'école de médecine en particulier s'est enrichie de tout l'apport de médecine arabe, et en 1505, au moment où Cristol fréquente pour la dernière année sans doute les bancs de l'université, c'est encore Avicenne qui est l'auteur le plus étudié dans le programme délivré aux étudiants en médecine, et je crois bien que c'est Avicenne qui cite le plus souvent d'ailleurs dans sa version du Platine. Alors, on sait que 1505, le contact avec le monde andalou n'existe plus, mais il est tout de même prolongé par la présence très forte à Montpellier de la minorité marane. Faut-il alors envisager cette recette comme un apport récent de la communauté marane qui a fui l'Espagne et qui est venue s'installer à Montpellier? Un médecin comme Jean Falcon, qui est un de Régent qui a sans doute supervisé l'élaboration de ce livre, fait partie de cette communauté. Et je le verrai bien comme le dernier maillon des interférences culinaires de longue durée entre Montpellier et le monde andalou. Cependant, j'ai beaucoup parlé au conditionnel parce que rien ne me permet de trancher entre ces deux hypothèses. Et ce qui serait intéressant de savoir, et que je ne connais pas du tout, c'est la généalogie de l'introduction dans la littérature culinaire occidentale des recettes de tagine. Si bien que ma conclusion sera en forme de question. question d'une moderniste qui s'adresse à des médiévistes, bons connaisseurs du patrimoine culinaire occidental. Est-ce qu'on trouve, avant 1505, avant la publication de ce livre, une quelconque mention d'un tagine ou d'un plat qui lui approche dans le répertoire culinaire occidental? Est-ce qu'on a, avant Cristol, la trace d'une transmission textuelle d'un tagine? Voilà ma conclusion ouverte, et voilà les quelques données que j'ai pu rassembler pour l'instant sur Cristol.
Un énorme merci pour cette très intéressante conférence. Plusieurs personnes ont réagi au niveau des panélistes dans la discussion pour juste vous remercier pour l'intérêt de cette conférence. Actuellement, je n'ai pas de questions. On va peut-être voir si Bruno Loriot ou Aline Grieco voudraient réagir. Ben voilà, Bruno, c'est à toi.
J'ai pas de réponse à la question de Madeleine, hein, la question conclusive de cette belle démonstration. Bon, moi, je suis toujours assez méfiant, hein, sur les transferts qui peuvent être simplement des transferts de titres plus que de textes. Alors, par contre, il peut y avoir des transferts techniques, bien entendu. Là, il faudrait faire une analyse peut-être plus vaste, éventuellement aller voir de l'autre côté des Pyrénées, bien entendu, hein, de voir s'il n'y a pas des relais, hein, qui ont été pris. Peut-être, je ne sais pas, est-ce que tu as regardé le modus? C'est toujours, je revends toujours le même traité, c'est-à-dire ce traité occitan-latin de la fin du XIVe siècle, qui a beaucoup...
Destiné aux voyageurs, c'est ça?
Voilà, alors entre autres, hein, entre autres. Et donc, c'est quand même, du point de vue géographique, le plus proche de tes affaires, même si du point de vue chronologique, ce n'est pas le cas, hein, bien sûr. Hein. Donc peut-être, bon, moi j'ai le texte, je peux te le passer, hein, mais il me semblait te l'avoir passé, je ne suis pas sûr. Et donc, je te le ferai envoyer, et tu regarderas s'il y a des choses qui ressemblent à ça. Et puis nous, bah, du côté de CoReMA, eh bien, on va essayer de trouver, hein, donc à travers notre rubrique prescriptions, hein, qui décrit au fond, qui sont les verbes qui décrivent la manière de cuire, hein. Peut-être on peut trouver des choses, hein. Et puis tools aussi, c'est-à-dire le récipient. Voilà. Dans la cuisine italienne aussi, il doit y avoir des points communs, à mon avis. Donc, ce n'est pas perdu. On n'a pas de réponse immédiate, mais ce n'est pas perdu.
Oui, merci, merci. Ce n'est pas un transfert de titre, hein. Tu as vu qu'il l'appelle
oui, tout à fait.
gigot ou chapon. Voilà. Ça peut être qu'un transfert de technique éventuellement, c'est certain.
C'est ça.
J'ai un commentaire de Béatrice Regnault qui vous remercie tout d'abord pour cette très intéressante analyse de Platine et qui suggérait de voir avec Marie-Joseph Moncorgé, qui a justement étudié la cuisine méditerranéenne, si elle ne pourrait pas vous apporter le niveau de précision.
Il y a beaucoup de spécialistes, hein, sur ces questions. Des vrais. Bon.
Pour ma part, je n'ai plus aucun commentaire ni question.
Alain,
Well, okay. Merci Madeleine, c'était très intéressant. Je cherchais dans ma tête des exemples en italien, mais ça ne me venait pas du tout. Mais bon, quand on cherche, on trouve. C'est pas l'inverse. Donc, I guess I'm going to be concluding because we're already 10 minutes over our allotted time. And I will say that all of the proceedings of this morning will be available as of tomorrow. So you can watch them over again. Et donc, je le dis aussi en français. À partir de demain, vous pouvez revoir toute cette session de ce matin. Et il me reste que de dire bonne journée à tout le monde et bon travail. Goodbye.